So let me go ahead and get started. I believe you should all be able to see my slides right now. So you might have been wondering, the gem in we, workplace inclusivity. Interesting title, Jocelyn. So it's partially a nod to the fact that a lot of people pronounce it as Gemini. Also, the gem in we, the collective us, our Gemini locations, across NoirLab and Aura, and of course, across all of our users. So I'll say it one more time that you can always message Alicia in Whova. She's going to be moderating and helping me answer questions. If you scroll down in Whova, you can message her just by the click of a button. So now that I've convinced you that my pun is valid, I hope that this will spring a series for the future science meetings. So this was Alicia's idea to include a type of talk focused on DEI in these meetings, which I think is great. So you'll see on the left in my slide that we have a raw citrine crystal and a heart-shaped citrine gemstone. They just so happen to be Gemini yellow colored, not sure how that happened. So to use some crystal healing language, right? It's so helpful that you all set your intention for inclusion, right? Towards progress and positivity. But I think we all know that it takes planning and action and skill to refine and cut this type of raw intention crystal into a multifaceted gem. And then, manifest your destiny. So I hope to break down that process of refining for you today and leave you with some gems to take home. So now that I've lost, about half of the audience to that extended metaphor, I'll just remind you that, when you signed up for this meeting, you agreed to a code of conduct. I would say that's a great example of setting a foundation of creating an inclusive environment. And I just wanted to remind everyone before we start today that we want to treat everyone with courtesy, dignity, and respect. And, be free from any form of discrimination and enjoy an environment free from unwelcome behavior so that we can, really grow together and create a nice environment. All right, so who am I? My name is Jocelyn Ferrara. I have she, her, hers pronouns, and I am your devoted Gemini North Science Operations Specialist and Diversity Advocate. So I just finished a night shift yesterday morning, getting data for all of you. So cheers to that, fueled by caffeine. And I am a diversity advocate. So what is a diversity advocate? Well, we have 8 of us distributed across the different Aura centers. That includes NoirLab, which Gemini is now a part of, Space Telescope Science Institute, and NSO, the National Solar Observatory. All of the diversity advocates are part of the Aura Equity and Inclusion Council that's headed by our Chief Diversity Officer of Aura, Amira McBride. So we collaborate at the Aura level, and then at the NoirLab level, there's a recently launched DEI task force where employees who volunteered across NoirLab are working together now on DEI initiatives, and all of the diversity advocates are ex officio members, the NoirLab ones, that is. Finally, the DAs, diversity advocates, meet monthly with the Gemini and NoirLab directorate. So we really do have the ear of leadership and a really great structure in place that allows us to work at all different levels and get help at all different levels, right? It's a great network, and we're looking at how we can improve diversity, equity, inclusion at all levels. So what is diversity and equity and inclusion? Well, that's actually the next slide. We're going to get to that later. Sorry. I actually do just want to launch straight into, now that I've told you about my organization and the types of things that we're doing, what types of things are happening at your organization or workplace? So before we even get into any background, let's just go and figure it out right now. So I will have a poll that is launching. Actually, I think it might not show up for a couple minutes, but they will ask you to rate your organization on these two levels across this rubric. So let's just start looking through this rubric before this poll shows up in Whova in about 1 minute. So there's a kind of a spectrum of where you might be in terms of inclusion in your workplace. You might be at the pre-awareness stage where the general population is unaware of bias at all. They don't know it's an issue for diverse groups. It's a very homogenous organization, and that is the norm. People might be saying, in conversation, that diversity and excellence are mutually exclusive concepts. You might be there. Diversity awareness is just the beginning, growing awareness that this bias does exist and that diverse groups are negatively impacted by it and are just starting to figure out, well, how do we fix it? So at this point, people, do believe these barriers exist for different groups. And the people who are working on this, it's kind of delegated to the underrepresented minorities and women, right? The people who this bias affects are the ones who are in charge of these initiatives. Finally, there's a transition state before we kind of get into inclusion, where the organizational culture, it's changing. We're getting progress. There's funding, there's leadership supporting it. People are making an effort, but they might be struggling. They might not know exactly what to do. But you're getting towards intentional inclusion, which is where this culture change, right, towards inclusion is embraced, and people are able to accept and articulate on how and why diversity is important. So in discussion, you're intentionally, consciously including how diverse staff members may be affected by a decision. So it's built into the decision-making process, and improving the climate for diverse employees and recruiting and retaining diverse individuals from upper level down to entry level is seen as everybody's responsibility. Finally, this is the standard culture of inclusion. So it's not really thought of as a separate thing to value diversity. You don't need a diversity advocate. You don't need this type of special attention because it's already just woven into the organization. So it is the norm. It's assumed to be part of the way that you operate. So the polls are now open, and I invite you to, rate the general characteristic and the common behavior. And so I separated these out because they can be different. You might be in between two different states that is so normal to think that multiple apply to your workplace. So just try to answer as best as you can. I would say don't go off of what you as an individual feel, but what you see across your organization or institution. And please feel free to direct any questions about this in the chat. Just remember, your response will be anonymous, but it's a great step, first step to assess where you're at to see where you want to aim towards. So I really love this rubric. It's from Susan Drange Lee of UCLA's Guide to Assessing inclusion in an institution. So her guide has more language about an academic institution. The whole PDF of her self-assessment tool is available to download if you just scroll down in Whova under handouts. I invite you to download that. It goes into much more depth and different dimensions in an organization to assess. So I highly recommend that after the workshop, but we're just going to do these two main temperature points.
Jocelyn, I want to point out that some people are commenting they don't see the poll yet. Is there a way that, is there a publish button in the poll window?
Let me double check, because I do see some results have come through. So it looks like it should be viewable to some. But it is only 3 results, so it is possible that, yeah, okay. I think it is only the admins and speakers who are seeing it right now. So that's right. Let me see if I can quickly just publish one. And then, you know, once I publish, I think maybe I'll push us forward, but that's my apologies. It was just viewable by admins, and we want everyone to be able to answer. And you know what? I think I'm just going to push one through. So we're just going to do general characteristics and common behaviors, just so we can get it. And I am just going to use the rubric headers. So from pre-awareness to diversity awareness. All right. Okay, so hopefully you get prompted and you get a pop-up in your Whova right now. And you can answer now that you've had plenty of time to think about where your workplace sits along this rubric. So I do see the answers coming in. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate that. Just give it a little more time, but it is looking like diversity awareness, the second one, has taken a strong lead. And it's looking like it's coming out as a bell curve with diversity awareness at 52%. Give it a few more seconds. All right. So just to repeat, diversity awareness, right? We're aware of the issue, but we don't know how to fix it. Hopefully I can show you some ways that you yourself can launch this type of initiative in your organization. So the poll will remain open, and I will just continue on here. So the intro to DEI that I teased and then pull back, here it is. So this is just my individual perspective on DEI. So please, there are so many different ways to look at it, but I really kind of see it as a pyramid structure where one builds off the other. So diversity at the bottom of the pyramid is simply the presence of individuals with different identities, perspectives, and experiences. So you are hiring these people. They are part of your workforce. They are invited to the party. And then building on that, once they're there, looking at equity, I would define that as fair and impartial treatment, access, and opportunity. So everyone has equal access to opportunity, to advancement within the organization. Now that they're actually there, there is an acknowledgement of advantages and barriers that people may have. So I would say fair and equal are not actually synonyms. Treating everyone equally is not acknowledging that some have advantages and some have challenges. So to continue that little metaphor, you're asked to contribute to the playlist at the party, right? You have a place at the table. You can contribute to the organization and feel like you have just as much opportunity as anyone else. And finally, inclusion is when all these individuals who, now that they know, okay, I have career opportunities, I can feel comfortable that this is a workplace that values me, taking it to the next level where you're valued for your diverse perspective, identity, and respected for it. There are equitable policies, right, that are allowing you to, okay, take it to this next level and feel like you actually belong there. So you are asked to dance at the party. I have seen this visualized as Venn diagrams with all three, because there are ways that you could have diversity and inclusion, but not equity. So that would kind of look like, okay, I'm hiring diverse people, they feel valued for their perspectives, but they're never going to be a manager. Or equity and inclusion, you have a very homogenous group. Diversity and equity, the culture just doesn't make it to inclusion. There's no sense of belonging. So there's a lot of ways to visualize this. I just see them as building one on top of the other. And I thought that might be a helpful representation because, inclusion is our little point on top, and that's what we're striving to do. So that being said, just because they build on one another doesn't mean we can't work on all three areas simultaneously. Another way that I like to think about, okay, what does DEI touch in an organization? Where can we look to improve? So I think, the bulk of it is in policies and human resources. That's where you really get the D and the E, the diversity and the equity, when it's built into the organization itself. And inclusive culture is our little cherry on top, surrounded by our beautiful Noir Lab logo representation of all the different centers and projects. And then externally, how you engage in your workforce community and with outreach and education also, is an area where DE&I really impacts the quality, the value, the results of these efforts, kind of like, right, your external, your pipeline leading into your internal company. And that also matters. So I'm going to talk about all four of these areas, but I'll focus mostly on inclusive culture because that's why you're here. But I really do want to stress that these other areas matter. And you can find, where you have an impact, like where you want to focus on can be under any of these. So to start with policies and human resources, let's really get into what are these, like, how do you operate that ensures that you have a diverse and equitable workforce? so that you can then have the opportunity to really work on inclusion. So looking at your organization, employee metrics, just keeping track of who is there is the very first step. Who's getting hired every year? Who's leaving? What does it look like when you cross-cut in terms of departments, or who's in middle management, upper management? Just understanding what your organization looks like. If you have a retention problem, if people are leaving that are underrepresented minorities and women, that's just the first step, right? Do we have a problem? Are we, and oh wow, you might get so lucky and say, well, we have inclusion culture, right? We're at the end of the rubric. Great. But you do need to assess it, right? So the very first, going to the diversity level of the pyramid, you really want to look into the hiring process. What is your hiring process like? Are people even getting hired that have a different perspective than the norm of your organization? Where are the job ads posted? What conferences do you go to recruit? Is the language of the job ad inclusive? So these are just questions that you would ask your HR department or ask yourself if you're in that department. And you'll see that I phrase them all as questions because this is just more assessment. It's endless. And there's a lot of work behind all of these questions that we can dive into in more detail if you'd like to. But this is just how are you choosing who's on the hiring committee? Do they have guidelines? Are they given training, like unconscious bias training? And are they given a list of appropriate questions to ask? And are you collecting statistics with each round, right? The applicant pool, who gets an interview, who makes it to the short list, and who gets hired. We gotta get our data to start with. And then I hear an unmute from Alicia. Do we have a comment?
Well, I wanted to bring up a question that seems relevant to this slide. And the question was, how does an organization identify and address barriers without compromising personal privacy, especially when an organization is taking its first steps towards a diverse workforce?
That is a great question. So are you posing this as another question to add to this list? Or would you like me to answer it?
Well, it was from the Q&A, but I kind of thought it was related because I see in this slide some examples of possible barriers, as in barriers can exist in the hiring process itself. So while we're talking about these related things, I wanted to bring up this question so it could be addressed.
Absolutely. So identifying and addressing these barriers, I mean, I would say that this is why I call it under the human resources umbrella, because our HR professionals are, trained to prioritize privacy. So with these metrics and tracking of, applicant pools, they don't necessarily reveal it. And this is something I've seen in Aura too, where you don't want to display too many crosscuts, because it might potentially identify someone. But in terms of personal privacy, there are a lot of ways that you could talk to an HR professional or an ombuds person to start that initiative. And there are people who should be trained specifically in that. I don't know, Alicia, if you had anything to add to that.
So my thoughts about this question so in this question, I get a sense that it's asking, is a person who's already a part of our group somehow suffering by a barrier we have in place, and will addressing that barrier make them feel uncomfortable because we're putting them in the spotlight? Well, what I think about it is trying to anticipate those barriers before and learning how to identify them before that situation happens. So in the hiring process, or even in a job ad, you want to look at it through a different lens, a lens of, are the requirements of this job ad somehow ableist? Do they require the person to be physically abled in some way? And then you have to wonder, is that an absolute necessary functionality of the position that's being filled, right? Another barrier could be the location of the job. Is it absolutely necessary that a successful applicant needs to relocate to fulfill that position or to do their job to its fullest? So those are examples I see just of barriers in the process that could be try to be anticipated before a specific individual has to bring them up and try to address that inequity.
And I'll kind of add, this is more along the line of what I was talking about in terms of how giving avenues to speak up. A common thing is an anonymous survey or an anonymous, Google form, SurveyMonkey. There are mechanisms online where people can submit their concerns. I do understand, though, that if it's a small organization, it could be easily self-identifying. So that is a challenge. But I think, opening up that line and, like Alicia said, anticipating are two ways that I think you could address this. Anyone can respond in the Q&A, I believe. Is that right? Or is it just organizers? I do think that it can kind of turn into a discussion. So feel free as an attendee to chime in with your thoughts in the Q&A and discuss this further. I'll continue on. So once people are hired, in terms of onboarding, how do you support them? How do you help them acclimate to wherever they have moved? Sometimes it's international. This can be very challenging. How do you feel supported by your workplace, your community? How are you establishing the culture and the expectations? Once you're, ready to move on up, who's getting promoted? Is it a clear and transparent process that's decided by a fair and balanced committee? Is it clear what your career ladder is, what your future is? Is it defined? Is DEI a factor in your performance reviews? So in terms of a carrot and a stick, right? If you are someone who is promoting an inclusive environment, are you rewarded for that? Do you have access to promotion? This is definitely under the equity area. Conflict resolution with HR. This is very much under HR. How do you support your employees who make harassment complaints? Are they subject to retaliation? Do you have specific harassment or bullying policies in your organization? Do people feel comfortable coming forward with it? And in terms of more support to staff, do you have resources for supporting accessibility, supporting your caretakers, the mental health of all your employees? And, is leadership communicating and pushing out statements in times of upheaval? Are they taking the time to listen to and support staff? So this is really under the leadership area and the human resources. So these are just questions you can ask. I do understand that not everyone feels like they can affect these areas, but it is just showing the larger picture of the broad influence of DEI. So going to the two external bubbles that I showed you before, how are you engaging with your community? Who's getting your educational materials? Who's getting the benefit of your public outreach efforts? Are your external communications inclusive? What language are they in? How are you pushing out, the benefits of your organization to your community. What commitments or milestones for DEI have been made to funding sources and partners? Like NSF has a broader participation section where there's a statement that has to be made on how you are going to increase participation. So knowing that in your organization and being able to hold them accountable to that is important. What students are getting internships and research experience? How are you ensuring that your data, your output, your product is accessible to an inclusive audience or community? You know, who are you collaborating with? These, I think, are potential future talks in this series about time allocation, you know, our collaborations for Gemini and data accessibility. There are some projects going on in Noir Lab right now that are very interesting about this. And I think that in the future, we can offer some talks on this topic. Okay, so we've made it to inclusive culture. So this is really what you can personally affect, is how I feel. Okay, is there active and widespread employee participation with onboarding, mentoring, internships, outreach, education? Are you volunteering for outreach? Are you paying attention to what students you're giving internships? Are you mentoring people in your organization? And are you supported in that, you know? Do you have the time? Are you given support from your managers and leaders and, you know, rewarded for mentoring and volunteering or not volunteering, right? Do you have a charge code to volunteer? Is your workplace hosting discussions, workshops, trainings, or talks centered around DEI? And is this attendance supported? So some examples that I think are specific to Gemini and Noir Lab are, you know, the hashtag shutdown STEM discussions, town halls, trainings on how to be an ally, the bystander effect, unconscious bias trainings, and informational invited talks from DEI professionals. So this is something that you can organize, right? You can, there's also a DEI journal club in Noir Lab that was organized by a postdoc. So there's, you know, different ways that you can organize a training or even just have a discussion with your own group, with your team, with your department on this. Is it a discussion? If you're at the diversity awareness level, which most of you are, you know, this is just starting, right? This discussion is very important. This is what you can influence. And I think you'll see that, you know, it's very fulfilling to do this type of thing. I will stress that, you know, as I was saying, the previous two sections before are really going to take you through the rubric, right? That's really going to make the organizational change, because not everyone is going to come to your discussions, right? We have 90 participants here. I think there are 500 registered, and that was exactly what I expected, actually. You will only get 20% of people coming to these types of talks. That is the number that I have seen. So it's, you know, great to build that network and find those like-minded people who will help you and support. But to reach that rest of the 80%, I think it really does need to go into policy. So you can still have an impact here, building an inclusive culture. But at the same time, I would liken it to household recycling, where you know that there are a few large companies that are contributing most of the emissions. But that doesn't mean you stop recycling at home, right? That's really how I see it. And then this came up in the rubric, you know, are people other than underrepresented minorities performing this work and serving on committees? So I'd just like to show, you know, our Gemini Observatory working culture. It's made up of treating others as we would like to be treated, striving for personal and institutional growth over status quo, taking responsibility and accountability for our actions, acting with integrity in all we do, having mutual trust in all relationships, nurturing safety of people and equipment in all of our actions, and finally, embracing our diversity and promoting an inclusive environment. I would say that the first 5 items promote an inclusive environment. So it's there, it's built in, but I think, we have to get to the place where it's intentional along the rubric. It does need to be said, because you can default to the norm very easily. So creating and establishing this culture is a high task, but it can be accomplished through asking those types of questions that I just walked you all through, helping, create that culture of inclusion. What else can you have a direct impact on? Well, what are we in right now? Kind of a Zoom meeting. I mean, I guess I'm just talking at you in this workshop, but wow, meetings, right? And if you're doing, a lot of your work, your collaboration in meetings, it's good to think about and establish how to run a meeting inclusively. What are your standards for a meeting? Are you expected to treat everyone with civility and respect? Do you, pay attention of how much you're speaking or others around you are speaking? Do they get a chance to, or are they, relegated to taking notes every time? That's something to pay attention to. Who's taking the meeting minutes? Who's, given a voice? Who's having a seat at the table? I think with Zoom, it seems like we all have a seat at the table because there's not the conference room layout, but it's still something that when you're leading a meeting or you're in one where not all perspectives are being heard or valued, it's something you can speak up about. Is everyone's time respected? Do you have an agenda? Are you staying on time? We are all, work-life balance is very important, especially for people who are caretakers. Are you scheduling your meetings at a time that's convenient for everyone? And then finally, championing positive atmosphere through inclusive communication. So are you empowered to speak up and intervene in a respectful way? So this is something that Alicia and I developed for Noir Lab. And, I think we started with it as the Gemini inclusive meeting and then broadened it to Noir Lab. So we have it in English, Spanish, and Hawaiian. So this is an example. Please feel free to take this and use it. All of the slides that you see today are available for download on Whova. So I'd like to talk less now and hear from you. So was there anything that resonated with you? And what would you add? Also, would you like to go into depth about anything? Going with the gem metaphor, you have one small drawstring bag of gems for free. Which will you take home? I love those. So I will make a poll where you could respond if you'd like, or please feel free to speak up in the chat. And Alicia, if you see anything now, I would appreciate that. And I will just add a struck gold poll.
So I'd like to point out that someone posted a link in the chat to a resource they have at the UC Davis Physics and Astronomy. They teamed up with their institutional analysis office to administer a climate survey. And they posted a resource about looking more into that. So I encourage everyone to follow that link if they'd like to learn about climate surveys. A brief observation that was made in the chat is that at these diversity, equity, and inclusion centric events or talks, the participation rate is not everything we'd hope it to be. And it sends a message about how the organization or how the meeting or how the conference prioritizes that information. Because I am very pleased to see so many participants in this, and I am very pleased to see that this workshop was given an individual slot in the Gemini science meeting, that it doesn't conflict with a potentially important science talk or result or other workshop. And unfortunately, that isn't common practice at other large meetings. And sometimes a talk like this will be scheduled right alongside with something that will have a much higher draw. So that's also a factor in just elevating the importance of these topics, is to really pay attention to how they're scheduled and make them as easily accessible to everyone as they can be, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I love that 20%. You know, I'm not trying to say that it's necessarily disappointing, because I mean, I do think that I was stressing earlier, people don't necessarily feel supported in their time to do this. This is a new initiative in Noir Lab to roll out a charge code so everyone can dedicate a certain percent of their time to going to these types of events. People, I've been in workplaces where anything fun during the workday or anything that doesn't seem like it's right exactly within like what their functional work is, there are cultures where that's on your own time. Now you have to stay another hour. So it is definitely up to the leadership and the organization to promote that. I would also say something special with observatory operations is that we have a day crew and we have a night crew. So there's always people who are on a different site. There are people who are on a different schedule. So it is also important to schedule either multiple instances or record things so that they're accessible. It's always a challenge in an observatory to get everyone in one place at the same time. It never happens. So, some feedback about any gems or gold. I appreciate someone really enjoyed these suggested questions. I'm so sorry that I just read questions out loud to you for 15 minutes, but it's really where you have to start is hopefully, the answers to a lot of these questions are, I don't need to worry about this. This is in place already, right? But you do need to dissect and understand where you are. And I hope that those questions, lead to actions. I will say it's not a one size fits all type of thing, right? You might have different needs to focus on in your organization. You might have different strategies that people want to focus on. So I hope that just sparks your interest. I'll go on with some unsolicited advice since we're talking about some of the challenges. Just in my experience of being a DA, sometimes you feel like that kitten on the classic hang in there poster. But I think, you need to approach it with a humble perspective, understand that you are trying your best. You are not going to always have the answers, right? And people will not always respond to what you do and say. So you do need to pivot sometimes, right? Stay flexible. I encourage you to assume good intentions with everyone you're working with. I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to think they're a good person. Sometimes they react defensively, but looking beyond that and assuming that everyone does want the best and being patient in your communication is important. And in order to do that, I think having a supportive network is so key. Having a network of people who support you, who you can vent to, who you can ask questions, how would I respond to this, is so essential. I think, this audience, we're not necessarily all DEI professionals, right? So we do need to have resources. Speaking of which, if you scroll down in Whova, I have also, oh, not scroll down, I posted a link as an article in here. I'm not exactly sure where it shows up, but we have a whole Google Drive that has resources, research papers, facilitator guides for DEI activities that you could run yourself. Alicia put it together. I don't know, Alicia, if you wouldn't mind pasting that in the chat. It was posted as an article. It got a few likes on Whova, no big deal. It's definitely here on Whova, but I don't see it under the session exactly. But I think if you go to community and article sharing, it's at the very bottom because I shared it pretty early on. Oh, I think I found it. Okay. So I definitely recommend, diving in there. Yes, there we go.
Yeah.
So please, this is open to anyone with a link. Use these resources. Everything I talked about is built off of this. I also want to urge you, don't forget self-care, take care of yourself. And that, the small victories really do matter. I think there's a paper in that folder about how, cultural buy-in is important. So like I was saying, about how policies really matter because that's how you really ensure that your organization has DEI built into it. That is important, but having that buy-in and people who are just willing participants in this is very important. So anything you do, any of these questions, any one question you ask and maybe build off of for an initiative is amazing. You being here today is great. Even though it's not reaching everyone, it's still so essential. I have, the links in these slides as well, in case you download this later and come back to it. But that is really all I have. So I guess we are kind of at our 10-minute left mark for extended Q&A and chat. And I invite you to, share any thoughts. I do agree you could exchange experiences after the presentation. An organization recognizing work done by its staff would help accelerate change. Yes, so recognition and making it a valued thing is really going to help it gain traction in your workforce. If you get a higher performance review because it's built in as one of the things you're assessed on, is a great carrot. We have it built into our awards at the aura level. And I think we definitely have it at the aura level. One of, at the same level of science and engineering. It's another category that people are recognized for. And this year I went to Janice Harvey, who does a great Journey Through the Universe program at Gemini North and has been reaching local communities for so many years. I forget what year Journey is on, but having that recognized and valued is certainly important. So it's not just your own initiative, it's incentivized.
So Jocelyn, I have a question, and I wanted to know if you could remind us when your office hours were, like if someone wanted to ask you personally about these things, when you'll be available.
So I have at 2:45 Hawaiian time, which is in an hour and 45 minutes after the session, I have some slots available. I know Alicia has some in the following days as well.
Yeah, I am available from Hawaiian time 11:30 until 12 p.m. Hawaiian time, Wednesday and Thursday. And I see a new question that came up that I'd like to address as well. And the question is, what are strategies to help reconcile generational differences in approaches to affecting DE&I change?
That is a great question, because there are differences in how people react to the M word, which is mandatory. You can see that as a generational difference. You might see, the younger generations wanting to just change everything all at once. So strategies for that, I think it's important to make sure that you are getting feedback from all the different generations. Cancel culture, yes, that is real, that is newer. So I've seen this, I've seen organizations where you have kind of like a bimodal distribution. So you have a lot of older retirement age people and then a lot of early career. That kind of says something, right? You didn't retain your mid-career staff. They went elsewhere for opportunities. So looking at that, is also important to see, well, it seems like they were valuing the norm. They were staying with the way of operating of the older generation. So to help reconcile that, I welcome any comments from Alicia, but my thought is to just make sure you get feedback from everyone and try to find, the best approach that honors the desires of everyone, and to not simply just go with one way, right? To have a multifaceted approach.
I think that's really good advice. And honestly, it's just about, it's about bringing a lot of perspectives, right? Is the diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just this kind of silo of information or issues. So, when I started this work, I found that a lot of people were kind of resistant. When I moved from the United States to Chile, I found a lot of people were not really receiving the information well, or were kind of adverse to it because the perspectives being offered were from a US place. And so we took a lot of steps to try to bring in local perspectives, to try to raise Chilean issues within this framework. So that's, one way you can think about addressing maybe generational issues. Try to zoom in on some of those issues that might be plaguing the generation that's not identifying with these with this information yet, right? There are two questions in the Q&A, and I want to just draw attention to them. There was one that's asked, what is the perspective on the next steps for science collaborations to take to be more inclusive? Lots of collaborations have codes of conduct and leave it at that. But others have done more. It would be great to hear what you think should be the first step after setting up a code of conduct for new science collaboration.
Yeah, I'll think about that. So I know that this is what I was hoping would be a future talk, actually, because Dara Norman is has hired some people to actually look at this question in terms of collaborations and data accessibility. I think having a code of conduct is important for who is established in your collaboration. So in terms of, that's probably the equity portion of it, right? But looking at the diversity and the inclusion, right, is the next step. So I think assessing, who is entering the collaborations and the diversity area is important. And then for the inclusive part, I mean, I think, trying to think about, you know, bringing in possibly other discussions within your collaborations or sharing different resources among that collaboration could be important. You know, having different conversations than just what the next step in your research is. I think that could be a way to build and create an inclusive environment where you are speaking up about different things. That's my 2 cents. I see another question from Jamaica. Thank you, Jamaica. And also thank you, Meg, about, can staff request DEI support for dealing with certain issues? If so, how does one go about that? And mahalo to you. So, I mean, since Jamaica, so at Gemini North specifically, you know, you could always ask for support from me. As a DA, I have gotten requests for, hey, can you host this type of training? Or most recently, you know, hey, can we improve the transparency of like the visa process with international hires? So there are lots of different things that I've tackled because they've been brought up by different staff members. So for this specific example, you know, we have that in place, right? We have me, we have the DAs across Lab, and then on top of that, I'd say in general, there's HR. So, you know, I think HR should be able to support people if you have an ombuds person to just that you just want to express concerns to. That's another great avenue. And it's I just got a notification the next sessions are starting now. It's 1 p.m. If you need to go, you need to go. But I would say, you know, I am here for you. I'm giving this talk to this community and I want to support all of you. So it doesn't end here. The Whova session and the chat and the Q&A I've told is going to last it's going to be up for a month. So you can continue this conversation here in this Whova portal. So please, yes, request support from me. I am here for you. And hopefully, you know, you were able to exit this session with some gems to take with you. And so with that, I will respect your time as outlined in our inclusive meeting culture. And thank you so much for coming. We are the 20%. Thank you so much.
Joanna, if you're talking, you're muted.
Thank you. Just wanted to say thank you to Jocelyn and Alicia, and it's break time now. We have a 10-minute break and then we will start with the announcements and the other regular session talks. And there are some speakers that still need to test. So we'll be doing that. So just ignore us and come back in 10 minutes. So Jerry, if you wanna, oh, I see Jerry is in the backstage with Scott.
Just a second. Yeah, Scott, I guess as soon as you're made host, I think we are going to have to go back to the backstage because they're putting the slide up. Oh, never mind. Yeah, Scott,
Okay.
just go ahead and push your screen from here.
Yeah, it looks like I can do it now. Yep. Okay. Let's try that. Okay, is that full screen or does it show my menu bar on top?
It has your mini bar on top.
Okay, so I don't want to choose that one. Probably this then. Okay, how's that?
The second. Looks great.
Full
So
screen, no menu bar. Right.
perfect. And then if you could go forward a couple slides just to make sure. See, I can hear your space bar long before the thing changes, so there seems to be some lag. But also, just so you know, the moderator, which I don't know who's going to be doing it with Jamika
Right.
back in
Jamika.
here. But okay, Jamika, when you get to 2 minutes before the end of your talk time, you know, if you're supposed to have a Q&A part, it'll be 2 minutes before the Q&A part is supposed to start. She'll start putting these little stars towards the top of
Okay.
your screen. See those little stars?
Yep, got it. Okay.
It's very subtle, but that's the signal.
I wonder why those were appearing all day yesterday. Yes.
Oh, you noticed them?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, that
then,
works.
yep, then you can go
Okay,
ahead and
good.
stop sharing and you know, you can stay in here in the Zoom like this if you want, and until your
Right.
talk comes, and
Ready to
you
go.
should be good to go.
Okay, thanks, Jerry.
No problem. So whoever's going to put up the we're on break slide can do that.
Or if Janice just wants to put up her slide, since she starts next, it's a nice slide. There we go. That'll do. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I think we'll just wait one more minute for people to accrete. Okay, so on behalf of the Gemini staff, it's a real pleasure to welcome everybody to day 2 of the Gemini science meeting. Again, my name is Janice Lee, and I'm the chief scientist of Gemini. Started serving here in March. As we talked about yesterday, the talk sessions every day will begin with this round of announcements just to get oriented and to help everybody get the most out of both the program and the features of the Whova platform. So we had a fantastic start to the conference yesterday. So to recap, we set the stage with the State of Observatory talk and an overview of the current instrumentation, the current Gemini instrumentation suite. We had science and instrumentation talks on brown dwarfs and exoplanets. And then we capped it off with a mask design workshop for GMOS and F2. It was great. We had an average of 170 attendees just on the Zoom end of things. And the workshop was very well attended, 70, 80 people. If you missed any of it, we'll be posting the slides and the video recordings. And on Whova, you can go ahead and form your own chat groups, and we'd be remiss not to note that there was a pet pictures chat group set up. There's even a goat on here, I think. Okay, well, on to day 2. We've already had a really thought-provoking workplace inclusivity workshop on moving efforts on diversity inclusion forward in our various organizations, even in our collaborations. Really great discussions there that I hope will continue. Today, we'll set the stage with overviews of the really diverse proposal modes that Gemini offers to help you achieve your research program, and overview of our future instrumentation suite. Then we'll round it off with invited science talks in extragalactic astronomy, galaxy evolution, AGN, and black holes. Now here come the reminders. The way, if you weren't here yesterday, the way we are organizing the question and answer is through Whova, not through the Zoom chat, which is disabled. Look for this Q&A tab for each session in Whova. You can type your questions as we go along. You can even upvote questions, and the chair at the end of the talk during the 5-minute Q&A will select questions to be discussed with the speaker, and speakers can continue to follow up on the Q&A and other discussion points after the talk. The Q&A tabs, the discussions, they'll all persist throughout the meeting and for another month, at least another month after the meeting. Also, to build in more interaction, Within the meeting, each day from here on has a set of chat rooms available with the speakers, both before the talk sessions begin and after the talk sessions conclude. So here you can find the Google Doc, the Google Sheet that outlines the schedule, has all the links, and also the sign-up sheet. It's linked to the locations, it's linked to the agenda for each of the chat sessions directly in Whova. So please go there and see who is there to drop in and say hi to, or follow up on a question you had during a talk. If you have any problems at all, you can either go to the Whova community tab. There is an Ask Organizers Anything section. Or if you're having problems connecting to Whova, please email us at gemini21vsm@norlab.edu. Okay, and so with that, I will see if there are any questions on Whova about logistics before introducing the chair of the talk sessions today. Any questions? Aside from when will it start? Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's chairperson for the talk sessions. Haewon Sun is an assistant scientist based at Gemini North. I guess I've heard she's known to be the assistant scientist who is serving on the most instrument teams right now. You can see here that she is involved. She is a NIFS instrument scientist and also involved with GMOS, Juniors, Maroon X Graces, and IGRNs too. She's part of the science operations group. She's involved in all aspects of the Q mode observing, including phase 2 prep, the Q planning. She's a Q coordinator, and of course, executing your observations. She's part of the fast turnaround team. Her research interests are, of course, aligned with today's talks. She is interested in extragalactic multi-wavelength studies of AGN and their host galaxies, and of course, that is to understand the coevolution of black holes and galaxies. Haewon, are you there? You want to take it away?
Okay. Thank you, Janice, for introduction, and welcome to the Gemini Science Meeting Day 2. I'm Haewon Seo, actually, not Sun. And I will be chairing this session today. So we have 4 talks today. And I want to remind you that if you want to talk with speakers, please sign up for the chat session. And Jamika is our timekeeper, and she will notify speakers when there are 2 minutes left by putting stars on the slide until the speakers acknowledges. And as like yesterday, we'll not be monitoring the Zoom reactions, including Zoom chat, raising hands. So please make sure using Whova Q&A to ask questions during the talk. And you can also vote for your favorite questions. So our first speaker is Sandy. She's an astronomer at Gemini North, and she will talk about the proposal mode overview. Sandy, you can now share your screen, and you'll have 15-minute talk followed by 5-minute Q&A.
Thank you. So let me get the correct screen. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Can you see my slide?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, very good. So I will be describing the various ways you can get data at Gemini. My goal is that by the time I'm done, you'll know how to get the data you need in the time frame that you need it. But if you still have questions at the end, I do have a chat session open later today and tomorrow. And also, please go ahead and check out the Gemini research staff. I've got the link posted here. We all love to see science taken at the telescope and are very happy to help our users. So feel free to reach out to us. I've also got the link to our help desk system on this slide. And the slides are available as a PDF in the Hoover app. So for those of you who might not be familiar with Gemini, we do have the 2 telescopes, north and south, which between them cover the entire sky. And all of the observing modes that I'll be talking about here are exactly the same between the 2 sites. And both telescopes have both optical and infrared instruments, as you would have heard yesterday. All the data from both telescopes go into our archive. So there's data in there for the last 16 years. So I encourage you to go look in there, see if there's something that you might be able to use. PIs also get their data from the archive, and the proprietary periods are 6 to 12 months. In any case, when you submit a proposal for observations, the tool will automatically look at the archive, and if there is anything that looks like a duplicate of what you are asking to do, it will be flagged, and you'll need to justify why you need the new data. So it's to your advantage to go check out the archive. So we use what we call the phase 1 tool for all the observing modes, phase 1 tool or kit. So everything I'll be talking about next, you would use the same tool to submit your proposal. And I've got the link here, which gives you an overview of phase 1. In this slide, it's a summary of the different modes. So you've got the this column has the name of the mode or type of observing. The next column shows you the frequency at which we issue calls for new proposals. This third column lists any constraints on the affiliation with which the PI is associated. There's no constraint on COIs. And I wanted to highlight that the US does have an open sky policy. So any astronomer can go in through the US channel, although you do have to explain why you need US facilities and don't have anything else available to you. This next column is the typical number of hours available in each mode for a given 6-month period at each telescope. And then this last slide is the science band rankings. So the science that comes out of the time allocation committees is ranked in bands 1 through 3, where 1 is the highest priority, and band 3 is really just sort of filler observations for our queue. We are, especially in COVID days, really entirely a queue operated observatory. Band 4, which is poor weather. So that's the lowest priority, but it's what we can do, what we do if the weather's bad, but we can still be open. And there are no band 1 to 3 observations left available at that time. This is the same table, except the 3rd and 4th column. I'm just giving you some information on the the review process and the oversubscription. So things I wanted to highlight in this slide in particular is that our fast turnaround, which is our monthly call for proposals, students can be PIs or co-Is, which means that they can take part in the reviewing of the proposals, because fast turnaround proposals are reviewed by the other investigators in that cycle. The student is supervised, but this is a great way for students to get experience in both how to write, and review proposals. The other thing I wanted to highlight was standard semester programs, the oversubscription. When you put in your proposal, you have to specify your observations, so your target, your instrumentation, and the observing conditions that you need. And we find that typically the best conditions, so dark time, photometric conditions with good seeing, are oversubscribed by about a factor of 5 or more, but the bright time, poorer seeing, cirrusy conditions only oversubscribed by factors of about 2 to 3. So that's something to bear in mind. So let's see. In this slide, I'm now going to talk about each mode with an example of the science that has been done through that mode. So this is my slide for director's discretionary time. This was used to take data of our first confirmed interstellar visitor, Oumuamua. And the GMOS observations, the light curve showed that it had to be tumbling because the large amplitude of the light curve meant we were seeing a very different size of reflecting the light with time. It changed with time by a large amount, and the light curve did not repeat from one night to the next. So director's discretionary time, urgent and unique, and high impact science. Fast turnaround. For this mode, I chose some observations of white dwarfs. These white dwarfs were part of a larger survey, and they appeared to have very broad hydrogen lines, which implied very high gravity and a very high mass, in fact, higher than the Chandrasekhar limit. But they got GMOS spectra and found that, in fact, the lines showed Zeeman splitting, so there was a magnetic field. And once the magnetic field was taken into account, the surface gravity and the mass decline. So the end result was an improved initial final mass relation for these clusters. So fast turnaround program, good for completing a data set, a small project, or a feasibility study. Standard semester programs. So the example I chose here used regular proposal time in 2018 and 2019, but they also went to the archive and found data from 2010, which they included in their sample. So in the end, they got a good sized sample of galaxies. And they with IFU data showing both continuum, the spatial distribution of both the continuum and the ionized lines. So standard semester programs, not urgent, can use the higher, the larger amount of time, RA range, and instrumentation selection that some of the other modes do not offer. larger non-programs. The example I chose here is LP16, which so far is the program with the largest amount of time. They got almost 400 hours in 3.5 years, and they have published near-infrared spectra from more than 200 quasars, and the data are available at this link. So larger non-programs, projects require a lot of time, or not necessarily a lot of time, but time over multiple semesters. So finally, before I wrap up, I wanted a couple of things I wanted to bring to your attention. One is that you can also get observing time on the Subaru telescope in Hawaii through the Gemini Subaru Time Exchange Program. And then proposal tips, things which I see PIs not being aware of. One is that the Target Opportunity Program is, you can use that not only for transients, but for any object that you don't have the coordinates for. So objects that are going to be found in an ongoing survey or ongoing data reduction. And the other thing is, we love doing cutting edge science and pushing the telescope to its and the instruments to their limits. But if your science can handle slightly poorer seeing or a little bit of cloud, put in a proposal using those poorer conditions. You will have less competition in the TAC, and so more likely to get time. And you can play with the instrument ITCs and experiment with the signal to noise for different observing constraints. And I will, sorry, wrong slide. It's not going forward. I will end with, this is my last slide. I'll just leave it up and take questions, but it just lists the 5 modes, the frequency of their call, and notice that we do have a regular call coming up in the next week. A summary of the application and the webpage where you can get more information. So thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Sandy. And I guess your presentation is so clear, so there's no questions so far. So, so if you have any questions, please place your questions at the Q&A, the Huba app. And okay, if not, oh, there is a question. Okay. I was wondering how many FT proposals do you receive on average per month, which is the success rate?
So it's about a factor of 2, about half get time. But it does vary with each month. And they go into band 1 and 2, and we typically get, let's see, we get about 6, well, actually 2 to 10, so 2 to 10 new proposals, successful proposals a month, depending on the amount of time. It's 20 hours a month that we can use as fast turnaround.
Thank you. There's another question that the same constraint you just mentioned were at B, right? Not in the IR?
That's right. The in the visible and at zenith.
Okay, now we have to move on. And thank you again for Sandy. And our next speaker is Scott from Gemini North. He is an associate director for development at Gemini, and he will talk about the future instrument. Scott, you can share your, oh, Sandy, okay.
Yes,
great.
right. I'm just trying to get out of it. Yes, okay.
Thank you. And Scott, you can share your screen now. And you'll have 15 minutes for your presentation, followed by 5-minute Q&A.
Okay, I assume everything looks good. You see
Waiting
my
yes, perfect. Yep, great.
Yeah, so I think there might be a lag. I'll try and remember to advance the slide sooner than I need to. So I'm Scott Kleiman, Associate Director for Development at Gemini, and I want to talk about an overview about our future instrumentation. We heard a lot yesterday. We'll hear some more today and throughout this meeting. So I won't go into details because we'll have detailed presentations on most of the instruments. I do want to remind and maybe introduce to those who don't know Gemini. What you're seeing here in this image is the back of the Gemini Telescope, where we can mount 3 instruments simultaneously. And we can exchange between them just by moving the tertiary mirror. So we change instruments while we're slewing. So it's really no big deal to switch instruments multiple times during the night. We have 3 instruments we mount at all times. And we keep 4 instruments active, sort of as instruments that we support. And then we have additional visitor instruments that come for block periods of time, which can take a port. So already with our 4 instruments and 3 available ports, we have to do some swapping. So not every instrument is available at all times. So as I said yesterday, we heard a lot from Ruben on our current instruments. Greg Mace talked about iGrins and iGrins 2, and really the high throughput on iGrins and iGrins 2 makes them really unique instruments. Jacob talked about Maroon X. I show example lab spectrum here, and I think 20 centimeters per second, just astounding. So we're getting really unique and state-of-the-art performance there. Quinn talked about GPI2 and the improvements in contrast and limiting magnitude is going to be a big deal in GPI2 as we upgrade it and bring it to the north. So a lot of new, really top-notch capabilities here. And what we're here later on today are existing instrument or other new instruments. Ghost, Alan will talk about, and Ghost is going to be also a very high throughput instrument. It should be one of, if not the best, in terms of throughput, high resolution optical spectrograph on a large telescope. Scorpio, we'll hear from Massimo, and this is a really exciting instrument because we have 8 bands simultaneous coverage from optical to infrared, and it's designed for rapid acquisition and fast readout. Gaetano will talk about GNAO, revolutionizing, really upgrading, bringing the state-of-the-art an AO facility at Gemini North, and that's coupled with GearMOS, which we'll talk about. And finally, we'll look forward to something that we're just thinking about. We're not actually in progress now, GLAO, so the next generation AO facility that GNAO at Gemini North will help enable. And I've color-coded these instruments in a way to indicate that these instruments, we have a variety of different ways of bringing new instruments to the telescope right now. So the visitor instruments and high-graded iGrins here. Facility instruments, so these are instruments that Gemini owns, takes care of, is responsible for. And Ghost and Scorpio are very traditional facility instruments in that case. Gemini puts out a call, funds a team to build the instrument, takes ownership and maintains operation. Then we have these additional facility instruments highlighted as iGrins 2, GPI2, and GNAO that are coming in without, still something that Gemini is going to be adopting and supporting and owning, but the funding is coming in from a different way. iGrins 2 is coming in as part of the expanding our partnership and bringing Cassie and Korea into Gemini. GPI2 is externally funded by Quinn and the colleagues she mentioned. And GNAO, we brought additional funding in from the National Science Foundation to add that capability to Gemini. So we're bringing a lot of new facility instruments and without having to increase the funds we're getting from our partners, contribute directly towards instrumentation. And then we have these transition instruments, Murnex and Gearmoss, which are initially coming to Gemini as a visitor instrument, but which we see enough potential to be really state-of-the-art instruments, to be very attractive to our community, that we would like to envision a way to bring them in as facility instruments. But first they come as a visitor instrument, and we transition them into facility. So these are our plans for these two instruments, so we haven't actually committed to a process yet for those. And GLAO, we don't yet know how or if we're going to be able to bring that to the telescope. So I just left that as a TBD, but it's an exciting capability that Paul will talk about. So just outlining that, we get money from the Gemini partners. They contribute a set amount each year for operations and maintenance. And then it's a voluntary contribution on top of that for instrumentation development program. And that it's now standardized at 10% of your operations commitment contribution. You also then provide instrument development fund. That is voluntary, but the partners have been very good, and that has been fairly consistent over, or very well, it's been consistent over past several years. And so this is totaling now about $3 million a year. Now the partners want this money to come not to build an instrument center at Gemini, but to help bring new instruments to Gemini, but also by help funding their instrumentation teams. So it's not a mandate that it goes back, but the wording is in the international agreement that money is intended to reflect the contributions. So it's intended to reflect the fact that US put in X percent, Canada put in Y percent, Argentina put in Z percent, so on for every partner. So in addition now, as I've mentioned, we have additional ways to bring money in, external funding to Gemini. So there's the NSF award for GEMA and GNEO, and then external funding through our community, and a variety of different ways. Various national and private foundations have come in and provided money to bring new instruments to Gemini through either the upgrade program or through this visitor/transition program. So I don't want to talk too much about the instruments because there will be more details coming up. But just in case you missed yesterday's talks or can't attend all of them today, GHOST will be again very high throughput, simultaneous coverage. So we're getting everything in one shot between about 360 and one micron at 50K for two objects, or about 75K for one object, and then plus sky. GHOST is ready for commissioning. We just need the ability to get people to the telescope from all over the world to do the commissioning, and the ability to build it, to have a team work closely together. So we are hopeful that COVID will allow us to do this in early 2022 calendar year, but that remains to be seen. Everything has been ready. We could have been done by now in a pre-COVID world. iGRINS 2. This is also very high throughput, which is it's really claim to fame. It already was doing 8-meter class science on 2 and 4 meter telescopes, and so on an 8-meter telescope, but it's doing outstanding science given the very high throughput. So we're getting our own version of this through the CASI joining of Gemini. High resolution, high throughput, simultaneous H&K spectrograph. Currently planned for the end of 2023, and I should add that the team has been remarkably consistent on meeting schedule to date, despite some COVID setbacks already. Scorpio is our 8-band optical and infrared imager, simultaneous coverage again. So we're seeing a trend here. So we're getting lots of data. You don't have to decide which band pass, which area you want in a lot of our new instruments, covering this broad range from UV optical into the near infrared, with a imaging mode and a 3 arc-minute long slit spectroscopy mode. Rapid acquisition, rapid readout, designed to be ready at the start of the LSST, the actual survey. Both Scorpio and LSST has been delayed for about a year given COVID. So we'll see how that continues. But right now we're kind of delayed together, and so we can still stay aligned. Lots of different subcomponents, subcontract works getting delayed because some vendors can't get to the office, can't get to the factory, or delayed in producing things. But Scorpio is very much in the build phase. We are new parts are arriving all the time, and the assemblies being done partly at Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio, Texas, and also at Fractal and University of Madrid, who was the lab space that Fractal is using in Spain. And finally, GNAO and Gearmoss, which we'll hear about later today. This is the new AO facility for Gemini North. Gearmoss will be this really multi-purpose instrument, multiple IFUs and an imager. The IFUs can be separated throughout the field of view, about 2 arc minutes of GNAO, and using their own MOAO in addition to the GNAO corrected beam, or you can tile them together to get a very compact central region and use the GNAO LTAO mode. So very lots of different things you can do with that instrument, very versatile. And we'll hear more about that, but that's still several years down the road before GNAO and Gearmoss come. So looking forward, GLAO is one of the concepts that we're looking at. The laser guide star facility that GNAO is developing will provide a lot of additional capabilities. And so one way is we can reconfigure that same guide star facility to serve a GLAO mode that uses an adaptive secondary. So there is no AO bench. We don't have to pick off or separate the light, the diachroic. All the correction is being done at the secondary mirror. So basically, any instrument mounted on the instrument support structure at our cast focus gets the advantage of this seeing improved, higher image quality beam. We're completing right now the feasibility study for that, and you'll hear about that in Paul's talk. The bottom line, I won't steal his thunder too much, is that we found, conceptually a way that we can do this, and we're working with several science cases now. We want to still now expand the idea of instrumentation in the science case with our community, see do we get a consensus that this is the way we want to go, and then we can work towards finding funding for that. With our instrument development fund that I outlined earlier, our current commitments for Ghost and Scorpio and our other ongoing upgrade programs, some of which Ruben mentioned, are, so thank you. I see the stars. I'll wrap up shortly. The next funding wedge from that funding stream comes up in about 2027. So if you don't find additional funding, that's the next opportunity for us to do GLAO, or if you find some other capability that we would like, that's the next natural time. However, we have these additional ways to bring in additional funding, so that's another way we can go forward. And finally, just food for thought, maybe for discussion now or later. What I mentioned, we have 3 instruments mounted on the telescope at all times, 4 that we support. That means we have to port swap. We have to share one of the access ports with at least one other instrument. And with all these new instruments coming online, that's actually getting to be a problem. It's a good problem to have, but how we select which 3 instruments out of 4, or which 4 out of the many we keep active is an ongoing question. So the best way we've discovered to try and do this is to cheat a little bit and come up with 5 instruments on Gemini North by time sharing GPI2 and Maroon X, both of which are doing some extrasolar planetary work, among other things, but in a way that might complement each other, in a way that maybe we could have GPI2 on for a while and Maroon X for a while at some cadence that makes sense. So we are really interested in hearing your thoughts about how such a regular swap might work. And then finally, I have some chat times open Wednesday and Thursday if you want to talk about getting more information on these instruments, or talk about your instrument idea, or bringing an upgrade, or other visitor instrument to Gemini. I'm very happy to hear your ideas and talk to you about that. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Scott. And now we'll take questions, and I think not yet posted. So if you have any questions, please place on the Kuba Q&A app. And Elizabeth pointed out that the individual future instrument talk will be on tomorrow, not today.
Oh, thank you.
Anybody has questions?
The detailed questions you'll have chance, of course, during the more detailed talks that are coming up.
Yep. I will refresh. Okay. Still, there's no questions. Oh, there's questions from Joel. Do you anticipate following up BRO LSST targets will constrain instrument availability in the future?
So I think we have to, as an observatory, as a community, decide how formally we're going to follow up things like Rubin Observatory and the survey, and whether or not we, right now it's basically by demand. And so as our community applies for time through all the mechanisms Sandy just outlined, that determines what instruments go on the telescope. And if everybody's applying for Scorpio to follow LSST, then Scorpio is what stays on the telescope. There are other models you can imagine where we try and set up blocks of time for follow-up and in different ways. And we still have options to do that, but that would be a very much community operations focused discussion if we want to do that. Otherwise, it's really reflecting the telescope, the instrument allocations on the telescope will reflect the user demand. I don't know if that helped.
Thank you. There's another question that in the last slide, GNRS was going to be replaced in the future. Is this going to be permanent?
So when, this is an artifact of our embarrassment of riches. With all the new instruments coming and our ability to only support 4 instruments at a time means something has to go. So one of the thoughts was with GNEO and GearMOS that we might be able, that at least the least painful remaining instrument that we could decommission would be GNRS. So that is indeed the plan, unless we end up changing our model of 4 instruments. But yes, something has to make room for the new instruments.
Thank you. And the other question is, won't GS get crowded with Ghost and Scorpio?
So Gemini South would look something like, let's see, GMOS. So GPI is leaving the South. And so what we're stuck with, we've got GMOS, Ghost, Scorpio, and then you're trying to balance Flamingos 2 and GSAOI. And so that will be the sore point there. That's 5 instruments. How do we manage that? So yeah, that will be a similar problem in the South.
And there's a comment from Andy Adamson that there is a chat session tomorrow morning with Jacob, Bin, and Bruce and Andy to talk about the scheduling of NeuroNext and GPI2. So if you're interested, please, do the chat session. And, okay, there's no more questions. Then we can move on to the next speaker. So if you have any questions, please continue the discussion on the Q&A. And okay, next speaker is our invited science talk. So if you want to talk with speaker, please sign up to the chat session. And the speaker is Christy Webb. She's a 4th-year PhD student at the University of Waterloo. She will talk about the Go Green survey, and Christy, you'll have 20-minute talk followed by 5-minute Q&A. Let's welcome Christy Webb.
Hi, everyone. First of all, you can see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Perfect. So thank you to the organizers for putting together this great conference and for the opportunity to include my research in this conversation. My name is Christy Webb. I am a 4th-year PhD at the University of Waterloo, which is on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. In the next few minutes, I want to explain what we have learned from the Go Green survey about how galaxies evolve in general and specifically in large clusters. But before all that, I want to start by explaining the motivation behind the Go Green survey in the context of these two keywords: satellite, as in galaxies which are members of larger halos, and quenching, which refers to the transformation of galaxies from actively forming stars to a longer episode of quiescence. So galaxy formation and evolution is driven by star formation. One of the ways that we can look at this is to count the number of galaxies over time and see how this distribution changes. If we start with the number of galaxies that we see at early times, here at around redshift of 3, and sort by stellar mass, we can apply a naive prediction for galaxy evolution, where you might expect that over time you see a horizontal shift as galaxies continue building up their stellar mass. If we plot the number of galaxies that we actually do observe at different redshifts, however, where here this cartoon is based on observations from the Alta Vista survey, you see that there isn't this expected mass growth at the most massive galaxies. The most massive galaxies actually disappear. Only at lower stellar masses is there mass growth, and this coincides to appear like a vertical shift overall. So what's happening? It turns out that there's actually a second population of galaxies, which are not actively forming stars. Instead, they're quiescent. And we call the transformation between star forming and quiescent quenching, which is generally accepted to not be a great term, but it's stuck nonetheless. And the numbers of quiescent galaxies are increasing with time, particularly at higher stellar masses, which explains the lack of mass growth in the star forming population. So the principal interest of studies over the last few decades is to explain the how and when of this quenching. How quenching operates can be understood from the perspective of the steps involved in star formation, which we can break down in terms of the availability and the state of the gas in the interstellar medium of the galaxy. Disrupting any of these steps will lead to a suppression of star formation. And since many of these are related to mass-dependent processes such as supernova feedback and AGN, this leads to a quenching efficiency related to the stellar mass of the galaxy, which is why you get the mass-dependent growth in the quiescent population. If we now look at the number of quiescent galaxies and separate them by the density of their local environment, it's interesting that there's an overabundance of quiescent galaxies in high-density environments, i.e. galaxy clusters, with respect to lower density environments, which we call the field. This excess is largest at the lower stellar masses. So while galaxies in the field experience what we call self-quenching, in clusters, there's an additional environmental quenching mechanism. And this has been known for several years, especially well studied at redshifts of 0. And decades of work has come together to put together a number of reasons to explain how clusters encourage quenching. So broadly, there's two categories. There's gravitational, such as harassment or mergers, which leads to morphological transformations, or things that are related to the intercluster medium, which can cause strong dynamical pressures capable of stripping disks. So while the effectiveness of many of these quenching mechanisms depend on where you're looking at the cluster, a key difference between isolated galaxies and those in clusters is that galaxies and clusters are cut off from their cosmological inflow of gas. It's instead directed towards the cluster halo. So the consequence is that galaxies will eventually run out of gas to form stars, and we call this starvation. So these environmental quenching mechanisms, of course, function within the cluster itself, affecting galaxies only after they're accreted. Some of these mechanisms are relevant even at modest overdensities, though, such as groups or filaments. So given hierarchical assembly, this means that environmental quenching can occur before galaxies are in a cluster as we know them now. It's just that these groups themselves later accrete into clusters. But there's a third hypothesis that galaxies which end up in clusters are already unusual. They experienced enhanced self-quenching and formed the basis of a primordial quiescent population in protoclusters. So in the next few years, studies have moved beyond coming up with ideas for how galaxies can quench in clusters or finding which quenching mechanisms are most dominant, instead focusing on the when and where that galaxies that end up in clusters quench. So the question has changed. To this end, a helpful metric is the relative excess of quiescent galaxies in clusters compared to the field, which is usually normalized by the number of star-forming galaxies, but we'll ignore this here for explanation purposes. This can be interpreted also as the efficiency of environmental quenching. If we look at this metric over several different redshifts and comparing here now the filled circles measured by Julie Nantis a few years ago, we see that there's a sharp increase in the environmental quenching efficiency from redshifts of 1.6 to 1. This was measured for only a small number of clusters available at the time, however, but similar cluster studies demonstrate that there's actually a wide range in values that you can get, which is not unexpected given the variety in cluster properties. And it's also important to remember that in general, environmental effects are secondary to self-quenching, which is a strong function of stellar mass. So one of the main motivations behind the Go Green survey is to provide a complete sample of galaxies across a wide range of stellar masses, also in a wide variety of environments at a range of redshifts from 1 to 1.5. So I haven't yet introduced Go Green, and it's an acronym for Gemini Observations of Galaxies in Rich Early Environments, where as a result of a 5-year effort, we've recently completed a sample of 21 clusters and groups with an additional 5 clusters from the earlier G-class survey. And this has provided hundreds of galaxies with both deep unbiased spectroscopy and UV to near infrared photometry, complete to stellar masses of around 10 to 10.2. So in this first plot, the Go Green set galaxy systems are shown as green points beside systems studied at lower redshift, and the expected cluster mass evolution tracks. It's an important feature of Go Green that our systems are chosen to be representative of the progenitors of today's clusters like Coma and Virgo. One of the clusters is shown on the bottom left image where galaxies identified as cluster members are circled in green, or circled in red if the galaxy is along the line of sight but not a cluster member. It's these objects that make up the sample of field galaxies, rounding out our sample of galaxies in different environments. On the right is an example of the photometry and spectroscopy with important age and metallicity diagnostics label. The photometry is at near ultradistant depths, which provides a nice comparison sample for this large field survey. So I want to acknowledge that this is a product of many people. Listed here is just the core group of contributors with a management team in bold and postdocs and students such as myself in green. From this group, we've produced this first list of papers from the first Go Green results, where I've started the works that I'll present in this talk and show the basis of those lead authors. So for the next part of this talk, I'm going to try and put these results in the 4 papers here in the context of the when and where of environmental quenching. The 3 scenarios that we've outlined to explain the overabundance of quiescent galaxies and clusters listed here on the right have different implications for what clusters look like in terms of the shape of the stellar mass function, which is to say how the relative overabundance of quiescent galaxy depends on mass, how galaxies transition between star-forming and quiescent states, whether environmental quenching depends on things like halo mass, and finally, the ages of the quiescent populations. So we'll work our way through this list as we proceed through the next few slides. As we've seen already in the local universe, the relative number of quiescent galaxies and clusters is higher compared to the field populations, particularly at lower stellar masses. This can be explained if environmental quenching has no mass dependence. All star-forming galaxies are equally likely to be quenched in clusters, and there are just more low-mass galaxies available to be quenched. This is nicely shown in a paper by Eugene Peng in their 2010 paper. So this blue dotted line here is going to be the stellar mass function for the field star-forming population. So both Jeffrey Chang and Remco Vandenberg made comparable measurements with Go Green now at redshifts 1 to 1.4, where we can see that to a high precision, the shape of the stellar mass functions are identical between cluster and field. Unlike at redshift 0, this cannot be explained by mass-independent quenching mechanism. Since the shape of the star-forming stellar mass function in the field is different, you'd end up with an overabundance of low-mass galaxies, low-mass quiescent galaxies, which is what we see at low redshifts. So we can draw a cross through option 1 as being the sole explanation for environmental quenching, if indeed environmental quenching is mass-independent, like we see at local redshifts. And if pre-processing plays a significant role in environmental quenching, again, you naively expect some sort of mass-dependent effect on stellar mass function. So that rules out options 1 and 2, but option 3 is kind of a nice explanation. So the scenario here is that there's a primordial quiescent population of clusters. The progenitors of cluster galaxies simply have a head start in formation, but the quenching is otherwise indistinguishable, hence the same shapes. So next we can look at the galaxies which are actively or recently transformed between star forming and quiescent. This paper was recently submitted by Karen McNabb, so you should see it on the archive soon. Because there isn't one universal mechanism for quenching galaxies, you can select transition galaxies in a few different ways. Collecting everything with colors between the blue star forming galaxies and red quiescent galaxies gives us the green Valley galaxies. Or we can select galaxies because their colors indicate that they were quenched recently or on short time scales, typically less than a gigayear. The purple crosses similarly represent recently quenched galaxies, but require spectroscopic identifications to the statistics are poor. If we again look at the relative excess, but now for each type of transition galaxy, we see that their fast transition and the Green Valley galaxies are similar. Both are overabundant in clusters at particularly lower stellar masses. This is telling us that most of the cluster-driven transformation may be through the fast quenching mode. If there was a significant slow transition population, the excess would be larger in the Green Valley galaxies, contrary to what we observed. So this excess in transition populations is related to both the rate of environmental quenching and the time spent in this transitional phase. Under a few simple assumptions about the accretion rate of galaxies onto clusters, we can try to compare this to the measurement of the excess in quiescent galaxies inferred from the stellar mass functions from Remco's work. We draw this comparison by asking what fraction of field star-forming galaxies would need to be added to the quiescent cluster population. The black circles show what's inferred from the stellar mass functions, from which we learn that there's no need for infall-based quenching. But on the other hand, Karen shows that there's a substantial population of fast quenched galaxies, where the solid line shown corresponds to an expected lifetime of these transition galaxies of around half a gigayear. Comparing the two shows that there's a discrepancy at the low mass end. You expect a larger excess in low mass quiescent galaxies that we don't observe. Doubling the time it takes the galaxies to transition between star forming and quiescent can help reconcile this, but then you need to explain why the transition timescale should be so long. So to summarize, there is a tension here between the transition population and the stellar mass functions in the context of the post-infall environmental quenching. There's still work to be done to place transition galaxies in the context of preprocessing or primordial cluster, in the context of primordial quiescent cluster populations, however. So one direct approach that we can take to explore the relevance of preprocessing is to compare the quiescent populations between clusters and groups. This was the subject of a paper published earlier this year by Andrew Reeves. Comparing the relative excess of quiescent cluster galaxies between clusters and groups, we see that at lower stellar masses, there's no excess in groups, but there is an excess in groups at high stellar masses. One interpretation here is that at low masses, galaxies quench primarily in massive clusters, but at the high mass end, they've already been quenched in groups. This points towards preprocessing being especially relevant in high stellar masses, which is perhaps confusing because the expectation might be that low mass galaxies would be more susceptible to being disrupted in smaller halos. So this is kind of a neat, interesting result. The last topic I want to present is what can be learned from the relative ages of quiescent galaxies between cluster and field environments. But before explaining the results of this work, which was published last year, let's quickly go over the predictions for each of these scenarios. Assuming that we can separate self and environmental quenching like we do to explain the low redshift stellar mass functions, that leaves us two quenching channels. The efficiency of self-quenching broadly traces the efficiency of star formation, peaking around redshifts of 2 around cosmic noon, which is relatively early in cosmic time. On the other hand, it takes a while for clusters to assemble. So environmental quenching, which here we mean any quenching process related to a galaxy's interaction with a larger halo after being accreted, this effect dominates at later times. So now consider that field galaxies only quench by the self-quenching channel, while cluster galaxies can quench by either channel. They just have to end up in a cluster at the end. The consequence is that the population of quiescent field galaxies would be older than the population of quiescent cluster galaxies. This follows because the second quenching channel for cluster galaxies supplies recently quenched galaxies, lowering the average age of that population. But we have to keep in mind that we've neglected pre-processing in this picture. If we do include pre-processing, where environmental quenching is now effective on group size halos, as we've seen from Andrew's work, the quenching would be more effective earlier on. But how much earlier is subject to several assumptions, and suffice to say that the pre-processing acts to lessen the age difference between the quiescent clustering field galaxies. Finally, consider if there is a primordial quiescent population in clusters. As before, quiescent field galaxies experience only self-quenching, but now galaxies that end up in clusters began forming stars sometime earlier and began self-quenching earlier. In this scenario, the sense of the age difference is reversed from before. Now quiescent cluster galaxies would be older. And there are a few reasons why this could work. So perhaps cluster galaxies existed in cosmic overdensities to begin with, and hence collapsed sometime earlier than those in lower density environments. Or if gas exhaustion is the primary quenching mechanisms, galaxies in protoclusters are simply exhausted earlier. So now we want to compare our expectations to what we actually measure from Go Green. And to determine the ages of the quiescent populations, what we need to do is simultaneously fit the spectroscopy and photometry. The photometry contains information like the stellar mass and the dust attenuation from the broad shape of the SED, while the spectroscopy contains detailed age and metal sensitive features from these old stellar populations. And because the dust attenuation, metallicity, and age are degenerate, in that they conspire to alter the galaxy SED in similar ways, we really need the combination of the photometry and spectroscopy to constrain each parameter individually. So in fitting the observations, we determine the star formation history, making no assumptions about the functional form, from which we can determine the age. So this tells us around the time at which half the stellar mass had formed, where the younger ages means that it took more time for the galaxy to build up the stellar mass. But it happens to actually be more useful for comparison purposes to change the units of the age from look-back time to cosmic time. And in units of cosmic time, we call this the formation redshift. So that's what we're going to be plotting here. So after fitting all the quiescent galaxies in Go Green, from which there's around 200 in clusters and 100 in the field, we can look at the distribution of formation redshifts as a function of stellar mass, now separated by environment. The open circles here indicate the median of each individual galaxy posterior because we're fitting the individual galaxies, but the contours now trace the combined likelihood space of all the galaxies. We can see that while there are field galaxies just as old as the oldest cluster galaxies, overall field galaxies have a broader distribution of ages, which is to say that the star formation histories are generally more extended. Thank you, yeah, I see the stars. Some component of this is related to the fact that galaxies are more likely to be rejuvenated or have secondary star formation events in the field, where now we mark galaxies with more than 10% of their stellar mass in the last gigayear with these stars. So if we now compare the combined likelihood space, summing over all of these masses, we can see that on average, quiescent galaxies and clusters are older, or in other words, they assembled their stellar mass faster than comparable field galaxies. The bars here above the histogram show the median and 68% confidence region of the posteriors, but the uncertainty on the median is too small to be visible. So we measured that quiescent galaxies and clusters are older, or at least the same age as the field in the lower 60th percentile of our confidence region. This tells us that post-infall environmental quenching alone cannot be responsible for redshifts around 1, mass dependent or not. Either pre-processing is needed, or at all mass scales, unlike what Andrew's measured. Or a modest primordial quiescent population is formed in protoclusters. So in the last few seconds, I'm just going to try to summarize all of these results together. These observations point towards the need for massive galaxies to have ended their star formation early at a redshift of 2, possibly in protoclusters. Environmental quenching post-infall at redshifts of 1 has very little role, but at lower stellar masses, the picture is less clear. The excess in quiescent galaxies and clusters can be explained by the transition population under some simple assumptions, and preprocessing is likely unimportant. There is a tension with the shape of the stellar mass function, however, and the sense of the age difference from the quiescent population, but there's a large enough statistical uncertainty that we can't be decisive enough to rule out this scenario. There's still more to be learned, especially exploring how the stellar mass functions of these two populations depend on the halo mass and redshift. Further insight will also come with observations of protoclusters, which will help determine the initial conditions of these cluster populations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk, Christy. And I will take questions from Q&A. And there's no questions so far, so I will ask one question. Do you consider the agent contamination from your sample? Because agent can quantify formation. And next speaker will talk about that.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have any mid-infrared data. We're limited to the first two IRAC channels. So although we could include it in our model, we wouldn't be able to make any constraints. The expectation would just be to return the prior. But certainly that could be a component that we've neglected.
Okay, thank you. And if anybody has questions, please place in the Q&A.
I think I still have another chat session this afternoon, so if anybody wants to speak one-on-one, I invite you to join me then as well.
Yeah. Okay, then I'm gonna ask another question. Probably I missed your talk during the talk. Yeah. What is your mass range of these clusters and field galaxies?
Oh, so the galaxies are 10 to the 10.2 to around 11.3, but the clusters themselves, we go from group scales to, let's see if I can bring up that slide and I can give you accurate numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really targeting the progenitors of group size halos as well as clusters that are even more massive than coma. So
Okay.
in the 10 to the 15 stellar mass range is at the high end.
Okay, they're very massive. Yeah, we have one questions from Brian. What kind of observations would you like to see in protoclusters to help stress test your scenario?
Oh, if we could have very high signal to noise spectroscopy of the quiescent galaxies, if there are any, that would be fantastic. But I know that's a big ask at this point. So I'm excited to see what some of the first few JWST programs will look like. So I think there'll be some good revolutions from that as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Christy again, and let's move on to the next speaker. Today's last speaker invited science talk, and our speaker is Chonghak Woo, a professor at Seoul National University in Korea. So he will talk about the black holes. And Chonghak, could you share your screen?
Sure.
You will have 20-minute talk followed by 5-minute Q&A. And Jamika will be notify you when there are 2 minutes left. You will see the stars on your slide, very small stars. So watch out that star. And okay, it looks good. Yeah, you can start.
Okay, all right. Sorry. Let me just use the spotlight. It doesn't go away. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present my science work. My talk title is slightly changed, but it contains the take-home message, so please take a look. The main topic is the agent feedback on star formation. So after giving you some backgrounds, I will present the highlights from our demography study of outflows and star formation, and then from IFU studies. So the first question is that why we want to study AGN feedback. The first motivation comes from the black hole galaxy coevolution paradigm. I see it changing. Okay. So for example, we know that black hole mass correlates with the host galaxy properties. And for example, here is the M sigma relation, the black hole mass versus stellar velocity dispersion relation. A popular interpretation of this correlation is that there must have been some sort of self-regulation between black hole growth and galaxy evolution. On the other hand, it's also possible that simply big galaxies host the big black holes without self-regulation. I'd like to show you one plot here, which is the intermediate mass black hole in NGC 4395, which is a dwarf galaxy, and we try to measure the black hole mass based on reverberation mapping. And this intermediate mass black hole and galaxy seems to follow the M sigma relation of supermassive black holes. This galaxy presumably didn't go through a major merger or energetic AGN phase. If this is the case, then probably the M sigma relation may not require the self-regulation or AGN feedback. So I would say the nature of the correlation is unclear, at least at the intermediate or the low mass, intermediate black hole mass regime and the low mass galaxy regime. The second motivation comes from the cosmological galaxy evolution models. So we know that the lambda CDM model predicts too many massive galaxies compared to the observed luminosity function. And perhaps AGN play an important role by suppressing or quenching star formation in massive systems and resolve this discrepancy. So these days, cosmological models routinely include AGN feedback to reproduce the observed galaxy properties. However, I would say we still need to have a smoking gun observational evidence of AGN feedback on the star formation. So now gas outflows are probably the main channel of the AGN feedback. So in this talk, by AGN feedback, I mean the regulation of star formation. We know that gas outflows at the large scales, 10 kiloparsec scales. And we also know that for individual galaxies, there's evidence of suppression and the triggering of star formation, and sometimes both for a given galaxy. So here is an example of positive feedback, the NGC 5728, as based on my former student, Jiejin Shin. So this galaxy has a biconical outflow, AGN outflow, and also it has a star forming ring at the center. So what happens, we think, is that the outflow encounters the ring, and then the compressing ISM and triggering or enhancing star formation. So if you see the H-alpha map, then basically at this encountering area, we see very high star formation rate, but in contrast, we see the lack of CO gas. So very high star formation efficiency, indicating probably the positive feedback. So now, although we have detailed studies of individual galaxies, we still need to have a good demography study of AGN outflows and star formation to unveil the nature of the AGN feedback. So the key questions are, the first, energetics, how much mass can be carried out by outflows? This is very uncertain. Secondly, what would be the overall impact of the feedback on global star formation? This is very complex. We actually need to have a spatial information to answer this. Third, what would be the time scale of the feedback, whether the suppression of star formation is instantaneous or in a short time scale, or maybe it takes a long time to see the decreased star formation rate after AGN activity. So these are the still remaining key questions. So my group at Seoul National University have been studying outflows over the last several years first by focusing on the demography of outflows and their impact on star formation. And secondly, they're based on the integral field spectroscopy data. So I will try to make several points from these studies. First, the outflows and their impact on star formation. We've been building up a large sample of type 1 and type 2 AGNs and a comparison sample of star-forming galaxies based on PPT classification and based on the broad emission line identification. For their star formation rate, we are using far infrared luminosity as a star formation rate indicator. But all sky surveys are typically very shallow in far infrared. So we also use the infrared luminosity estimates based on artificial neural network analysis from Sarah Ellis in 2016. So I'm not going to go in detail, but when we compare the star formation rates from these two methods, we get a consistent star formation rate. We also use the SDS-based infrared luminosity. But this applies only several tens of objects for consistency check. So to trace the ionized gas outflows, we are mainly using action 3 line, which typically shows 2 components. The narrow core component in red represent the gravitational potential of the host galaxy. But we see the very broad wing component, which is in blue. So that is due to the AGN outflows. So using this line profile, we measure first and second moment and determine the velocity and velocity dispersion of the gas to quantify the kinematics. So we think that these outflows are biconical shape with the hollow cone and partly extincted by dust in the stellar galaxy disk. So as you can see, sometimes we see blue shifted action 3, or sometimes we see red shifted action 3 line in the flux weighted Sloan spectra, depending on the orientation. So the first message is that these outflows are clearly driven by AGN, not by star formation. When we compare AGN with star-forming galaxies in this velocity dispersion diagram using action 3 line, we see a dramatic difference in their distributions. For example, AGN has a very high velocity dispersion, and it means that action 3 line is very broad. On the other hand, the star-forming galaxies have a very, very narrow action 3 line, so it's this clear distinction. So these kinematics of the outflows are clearly driven by AGN. Now, we can ask what fraction AGN has the outflows. The answer is that if you look at the high luminosity, then almost 100% of AGN shows the signature of the outflows. When we go to low luminosity, the outflow fraction is somewhat much lower, but probably this is due to the detection issues. Since the weak broad wing is very difficult to detect, so the outflow fraction we are measuring is relatively small. But if you have a deep enough observation, we probably find the signature of the outflows, even for low luminosity AGN. Now, when we compare the luminosity with the outflow velocity dispersion, we find a positive correlation. So this is not unexpected. The higher AGN luminosity, we find out stronger outflows. But for given AGN luminosity, if you see here, then there is quite a large range of velocity dispersion. So this means that there must be some other controlling parameters, such as gas fraction or density distribution, etc. However, the main driver of this outflow is the luminosity of the AGN. Now, I'd like to show you a key slides, the 2 key slides, and this one and next one. When we compare star formation rate with the action 3 velocity dispersion, we find a positive correlation instead of a negative correlation you may expect. So here is a specific star formation rate of type 1 AGN in blue and type 2 AGN in red. And the horizontal gray area is the main sequence and 1 sigma distribution of non-AGN star forming galaxies. So, and in x-axis, I'm showing you the action 3 velocity dispersion normalized by stellar velocity dispersion. So if you go to the right, it's a strong outflow. To the left, it's a weak or no outflow. So when we look at the agents with the strong outflows in the right-hand side, they tend to be above the main sequence. So this means that there's no quenching. We don't really see suppressed star formation rate. Instead, we see high star formation rate, even higher than main sequence. So this might be, there might be extra triggering of star formation due to AGN outflow. So it might be a signature of the positive feedback. On the other hand, if you look at the AGN without outflows, then they tend to be below the main sequence. So we don't even see the outflows, but star formation rate is much lower than the main sequence star forming galaxies. We have to explain why. So one scenario is that there was AGN activity and strong outflows, and they started impacting on the star formation, but only now we are able to see the decreased star formation rate. So this is the negative feedback, but it's a delayed negative feedback. If you look at the distributions of the specific star formation rate of AGN, type 1 AGN blue and type 2 AGN red compared to the specific star formation rate distribution of star forming galaxies in black, we also see the same trend. If you go down from strong outflow to weak outflow and no outflow AGN, we clearly see the decrease of the mean specific star formation rate, indicating the negative feedbacks happened some time ago. We performed the same analysis with the Eddington ratio. Again, in x-axis is Eddington ratio and y-axis is the specific star formation rate. And the horizontal area is the main sequence star forming galaxies. Now, if we look at the high Eddington ratio AGN, again, we don't see suppressed star formation rate and no quenching, but instead we see enhanced star formation rate. So AGN may have triggered more star formation rate for these objects. On the other hand, if you look at the low Eddington ratio AGN, they tend to be below their main sequence with the lower star formation rate. So this is again, we can say that maybe some time ago, there was a strong outflow and an AGN and started impacting on the star formation rate, but only now we see this suppressed star formation rate. And so this is the delayed negative feedback scenario. Distributions of specific star formation rate show the same thing in different ways. So if you go down to lower and lower Eddington ratios, you can clearly see the discrepancy between the galaxies, which is black, and the AGN in red. So in one hand, we have AGN with a strong outflows and high Eddington ratio, and these agents are hosted by highly star-forming galaxies. On the other hand, we have agents with a no outflow and low Eddington ratio, but these agents are hosted by galaxies with a very low star formation rate. So if you combine these two populations as a time sequence, then maybe you get the picture of delayed feedback scenario. So initially, agent outflows start impacting an ISM and perhaps enhancing star formation rate, but only after some time scale, we are able to see the decreased star formation observationally. So suppression of star formation cannot be directly or detected instantaneously because there's some time delay. And since there's no quenching, we cannot really get any observational evidence of suppressed star formation rate when AGN is very active. Okay, so I will move to the second part and show you some highlights from our IFU studies. So we've been observing type 2 AGN out to redshift 0.1 using various telescopes and instruments, but I will give you some highlights from the study based on Gemini GMOS IFU. So these are the optical images of the targets we observed out to redshift 0.1 They look like a typical star-forming galaxies, although they have a strong outflows. The blue box indicates the field of view of the CMOS IFU, covering several kiloparsec scales. Now, at each spectrum, we measure and we fit the emission lines and measure and velocity dispersion of gas kinematics. And here is an example of the velocity map in the left and the velocity dispersion map in the right. Based on action 3 line, they show strong outflow signatures. And if you look at the central part, the action 3 velocity dispersion is very, very high. So this is clearly the agent-driven outflows. Now, one unique thing we did in this analysis is that we measure the size of outflow based on spatially reserved data. So for example, here as a function of distance from the center, we see that the velocity dispersion of action 3 decreases, and at some point it becomes comparable to the stellar velocity dispersion. So beyond which we don't see any outflow signature. So by defining the edge of the outflow, we can measure the size of the outflow and use it for the outflow energetic calculations. So I'd like to point out that this outflow size, the kinematically measured outflow size, is typically smaller than the photoionization size, the size of the narrow line region. So if you want to calculate the outflow energetics, we have to use the proper size, the outflow size, instead of the photoionization size. Otherwise, we will substantially overestimate the AGN energetics. Now, if we compare these kinematically measured size with the luminosity, that we find the positive correlation, which is not unexpected. Basically, more luminous AGN have a larger outflow size. But if you look at the physical scale of these outflows, you may be disappointed. So here is about the 5 kiloparsec scale, and the majority of our sample has a relatively small outflow scale. So here the sample is that the blue are the AGNs observed with the CMOS. Our studies plus other studies in the literature combined with the other sample based on SNP's IFU with the Hawaii 2.2 telescope data. So basically, the main message here is that these outflows are confined within the center of the galaxy, and they probably do not make a strong impact on the large disk scales where probably the star formation is still ongoing. So if we apply this correlation to general population of the AGN, then we probably don't expect to see very strong major impact on the global or the total star formation rate, because the outflow impact is rather confined at the center. So this is my last slide. We typically see the inside-out structure based on photoionization analysis. So we can classify the source of the photoionization either by AGN, red, or by star formation in blue. At the central part, it's clearly dominated by AGN. It may or may not suggest a negative feedback, but interesting thing is that at the edge of the AGN, we see a ring-like structure in many objects. Ring-like structure of star formation in many objects. So gas is not completely expelled, and there's still star formation ongoing. Interestingly, the location of the ring is comparable to the edge of the outflow in kinematical analysis. So what we think is that maybe outflow slows down by compressing ISM and enhancing or triggering extra star formation at this region. So there might be positive and negative feedback together for a given object. So what would be the overall impact of outflows on the star formation, global star formation? Probably this is rather limited, because first, the outflows are confined at the central part, and secondly, there's also positive feedback. So here's my summary. Basically, at low redshift, we find no evidence of instantaneous quenching because we see a positive correlation between agent activity and star formation rate. Although nevertheless, we see the low Eddington ratio AGN with the no outflows, they have a much lower star formation rate than main sequence. So there must have been some sort of agent feedback in the past, and we now only see the decreased star formation rate. A few follow-up studies show that the outflow is confined in a relatively small region, and the star formation is ongoing in this, suggesting a limited impact on global star formation rate. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. And I will take questions from the Q&A. So, Janice, the question from Janice, do you have constraints on how long the star formation will last in the galaxies with strong agent outflows? For example, gas depletion timescale?
That is a very good question, but we don't have any data to answer that question. But the time scale for depending on the star formation rate indicator, we see different time scales. Since our star formation rate is based on far infrared or infrared, maybe we are looking at 10 to the 8 year time scale. So depending on when the previous strong agent activity happened in the past, time scale may be different, but I cannot really answer that.
Okay, next question is from Jennifer Lott. Do simulations of agent feedback make predictions about specific star formation rate versus outflow activity? How do they compare to your result?
Sorry, I cannot really see the Q&A, but can you repeat the last part? Specific star formation rate and?
Specific star formation rate versus outflow activity?
Outflow activity. Well, I'm not really doing the simulations or the semi-analytical models, so maybe I'm not qualified to answer that. But I think most of the cosmological models include agent feedback. But what I heard is that the quenching is not really instantaneous. But I do not know whether the outflow rate versus the specific star formation rate is well constrained by the models. Did I answer that question? I'm not sure.
And the question from Joel. Should we conclude from your results that galaxies evolve along the relations between agent activity and specific star formation rate throughout the agent duty cycle?
I think not. While I think the AGN play, maybe significant role, but in my opinion, it's probably this impact of agent outflow or feedback be rather limited based on the relatively low redshift study. But if you look at the high redshift, probably the environment is very different. So maybe agent feedback is very important, and the duty cycle is very important. But at least at low redshift, we don't see any strong evidence for that. Even at high redshift, theoretically, we can imagine this AGN role, but I think still we need to have a smoking gun observational evidence of AGN feedback on star formation and regulation of star formation.
Thank you. And I have a question. Since you studied both type 1 and type 2 agents, so is there any difference between stellar mass on type 1 and type 2 agents?
We are using the small sample mainly for the demography study, and I think they are somewhat different because we are using the galaxy catalog for type 2 AGN and try to select the type 2 AGNs. For type 1s, we are using the quasar catalog. So the stellar mass range is slightly different, but since we are using the normalized staff formation rate, the specific staff formation rate, probably that doesn't affect the main result we have.
Okay, thank you very much again. And we are running out of time. Please continue the discussion on the Q&A. And now there are chat sessions with speakers. So please go ahead directly to the Zoom link. And thanks again for all the speakers today for their discussion and presentations. I guess this is all for today. And thank you everyone for joining today. And I hope to see you all again tomorrow. Mahalo and bye-bye.
Thank you.